20 winters had passed since the promise was spoken, yet Caleb Turner still woke before sunrise every morning as though time itself had never learned how to move. The Wyoming mountains were silent beneath a blanket of fresh snow, and the wind carried the same lonely voice it had carried for decades. Routine had become the fence that kept grief from wandering too close. He rose from the narrow bed before the first light reached the cabin window. He stirred the ashes in the iron stove until orange embers breathed again, then added split pine logs one by one. The smell of wood smoke slowly filled the room. He poured water into a dented coffee pot that had survived longer than most friendships and waited without impatience. Waiting had become another part of his life. While the coffee simmered, he stepped onto the porch with a bucket of grain. The horses lifted their heads before he called them. They knew his footsteps as well as he knew the changing seasons. He checked the fence along the eastern pasture, brushed fresh snow from the gate, and paused beside the old cottonwood tree overlooking the valley. 20 winters earlier, that was where she had stood before leaving town forever. Emily Carter had been only 20 then, carrying a carpet bag that looked too heavy for someone so small. Her father had accepted work hundreds of miles east after drought ruined their farm. She had looked back only once before climbing into the stagecoach. Her smile had been brave, but her eyes had betrayed the fear she refused to show anyone else. "If you ever need me," she had whispered, almost laughing through her tears, "I will come back." Caleb had nodded because words failed him then, just as they often did now. He never asked her to stay. He never promised to wait. Yet somehow he had done exactly that. He returned to the cabin as the coffee reached a gentle boil. Without thinking, he placed 2 plain ceramic mugs on the rough wooden table. The first received a steady pour. The second followed a heartbeat later. Every first snowfall of winter, he prepared 2 cups. It had become a quiet tradition no one else understood. Folks in Dry Creek had stopped asking years ago. Some pitied him. Others simply accepted that lonely men often kept strange habits. Caleb never explained. Some promises did not belong to the world outside a cabin door. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug and looked toward the empty chair across from him. The chair remained neatly pushed beneath the table. Dust never settled there because he wiped it clean every morning. Not out of hope anymore, he told himself. Out of respect for a memory. A sudden knock echoed through the cabin. Once, then again, firm but unhurried. Caleb frowned. Visitors rarely climbed this far into the mountains once winter arrived. He opened the door. A gust of icy wind swept inside, carrying loose snow across the floorboards. Standing beneath the gray morning sky was an elderly lawyer wrapped in a dark wool coat, his horse breathing clouds into the cold air. The man removed his hat politely and held out a weathered leather envelope sealed with faded blue wax. "Mr. Turner?" he asked quietly. Caleb nodded once. "I was instructed to deliver this only after the 20th first snowfall." Caleb accepted the envelope without speaking. Across the front, written in careful handwriting he recognized instantly despite the passing years, were 5 simple words. For Caleb, "If I am late." Asterisk, asterisk, his fingers tightened around the familiar script as the wind howled through the valley once more. Caleb closed the cabin door against the wind before breaking the faded blue seal. The lawyer remained quietly on the porch, brushing snow from his sleeves while giving the old rancher all the privacy a difficult letter deserved. Caleb unfolded the paper with slow, careful hands. The first line stole the warmth from the room more completely than the winter outside ever could. "My dear Caleb, if this letter has reached you, then I have failed to return before the 20th first snowfall." He knew the handwriting as surely as he knew the lines on his own weathered hands. Emily's letters had always leaned slightly to the right, neat but never perfect, as though she hurried to finish each sentence before courage disappeared. He continued reading. "I wanted to come home years ago. Life simply kept asking for one more season. First my father became ill. Then my younger sister needed someone to raise her children after the fever took both parents. Every time I packed my trunk, someone else needed me more than I needed myself. I have often wondered whether you forgot the promise. Somehow, I never believed you would." Caleb lowered the page for a long moment. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees exactly as it had the morning she left. He had imagined 1,000 reasons for her silence over 20 years. Anger had never been one of them. He simply assumed life had given her happiness somewhere else. The lawyer knocked softly before stepping inside. He removed his gloves and held another envelope. "Miss Carter instructed me to give you this only after you finished the first one," he said quietly. She was very particular about the order. Caleb accepted the second envelope without speaking. "Is she?" He stopped before finishing the question. The lawyer understood anyway. "She is alive," he answered with a gentle smile. "But she has been ill for several months. She feared she might never have the strength to make this journey herself." Caleb closed his eyes only briefly. Relief arrived so quietly it almost hurt. The lawyer continued. "She lives at St. Anne's boarding house in Laramie. She has no family left now. Before I departed yesterday morning, she asked only one question." Caleb looked up. She asked whether the mountains still received their first snowfall before Thanksgiving. A faint smile touched Caleb's weathered face for what might have been the first time in years. "They always have." The lawyer nodded. "I gave her the same answer." Silence settled comfortably between the two men. Finally, the lawyer reached into his satchel one last time and removed a small bundle wrapped in faded blue cloth. "She asked me to bring this if I found you." Caleb unfolded the cloth carefully. Inside rested a hand-knitted wool scarf, unfinished except for one loose strand of yarn still hanging from its edge. Instantly, he remembered the autumn afternoon she had begun knitting beside the creek while he repaired a broken wagon wheel. She had laughed when the yarn tangled around her fingers. "I will finish it when I come back," she had promised. 20 years had passed, yet the final stitch still waited. Caleb gently brushed the wool between his fingers. It carried the faint scent of cedar despite the passing decades. The lawyer stood. "I have another day's ride before sunset." Caleb walked him to the porch. Before mounting his horse, the lawyer paused beside the gate. "Mr. Turner." Caleb looked up. "Miss Carter also told me something else." "What was that?" "She said if you no longer needed her, you should simply throw the second letter into the fire." Caleb looked back toward the cabin table where 2 cups of coffee still waited. The second cup had grown cold, just as it always did. Without hesitation, he carried both letters inside, reached for his heavy winter coat hanging beside the door, and quietly poured fresh coffee into the second mug. Before sunrise the next morning, Caleb saddled his oldest bay horse without speaking a single unnecessary word. Fresh snow still covered the narrow mountain trail, untouched except for rabbit tracks and the long shadows cast by pine trees beneath the pale winter sky. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. The second coffee cup stood empty for the first time in 20 years because he had finally carried it to the sink instead of leaving it on the table until nightfall. Hope changed even the smallest routines. He folded Emily's unfinished blue scarf with great care and placed it inside his saddlebag beside both letters. The lawyer had said Laramie lay nearly 3 days away if the weather remained kind. Winter was rarely kind, but Caleb had spent half his life crossing difficult country. The mountains knew him, and he knew them. As the ranch slowly disappeared behind him, memories rose with every mile. He remembered Emily laughing when she dropped a basket of apples into the creek. He remembered teaching her how to calm a frightened horse simply by lowering her voice. He remembered the afternoon she confessed she had always dreamed of seeing the Pacific Ocean, then laughed because she doubted she would ever travel that far. She had carried dreams much larger than the little valley could hold, and he had never blamed her for following them. By late afternoon, the clouds thickened, bringing another gentle snowfall. Caleb stopped beside an abandoned church where travelers often rested before crossing the frozen river. As he untied his bedroll, another wagon slowly approached through the falling snow. An elderly couple climbed down, their faces tired but warm. They invited him to share their campfire, and before long the conversation turned to ordinary things: weather, cattle, and long roads. Eventually the woman noticed the blue scarf lying beside Caleb's saddle. "A gift from your wife?" she asked kindly. Caleb looked at the unfinished stitches before answering. "Not yet," he said quietly. The old woman smiled without surprise. "Then she must be worth the wait." Caleb stared into the fire for several silent moments. She always was. The next morning, he crossed the frozen river while the sunrise painted the snow with soft shades of gold. Near midday, he reached a crossroads where a weather-beaten sign pointed toward Laramie. Nailed beneath it was a newer notice fluttering in the cold wind. Travelers were warned that St. Anne's boarding house had recently closed after an illness spread among several residents. Caleb's heartbeat slowed. He read the notice again, searching for another line, another clue. anything that might tell him where Emily had gone. There was nothing. He urged the horse forward anyway. By dusk, he entered the quiet streets of Laramie. The boarding house stood exactly where the lawyer had described, but its windows were dark and every shutter had been closed. Snow had gathered across the empty porch. Caleb climbed the wooden steps and gently touched the cold doorknob. It did not move. Then he noticed something tucked beneath the porch lantern, protected from the snow inside a small tin box. On top rested a folded piece of paper bearing his name in the handwriting he would recognize anywhere. She had expected him to come. Caleb lifted the small tin box with both hands as though it contained something far more fragile than paper. Snow had gathered across the porch of the abandoned boarding house, yet the note inside remained perfectly dry. Emily had chosen the hiding place carefully, knowing he would notice it before anything else. He unfolded the page. The words were short. "If you came, ask Mrs. Eleanor Brooks at the church on Willow Street. She knows where I have gone. Do not worry. I finally kept my promise." Caleb folded the note and slipped it safely into his coat pocket. The church stood only a few streets away, its white steeple rising above the quiet town. Warm candlelight glowed through the windows. Inside, several women arranged blankets and baskets of bread for families struggling through the winter. An older woman with silver hair looked up as Caleb entered. Before he could speak, she smiled gently. "You must be Caleb Turner." He nodded once. "Emily said you would come," Mrs. Brooks replied. "She always believed you would find your way here." She poured fresh coffee into 2 plain mugs and motioned toward a wooden table beside the fire. Caleb noticed the second cup before he noticed anything else. It reminded him of his own kitchen hundreds of miles away. Mrs. Brooks placed a small bundle of letters between them. "Emily volunteered here for almost 6 years," she said softly. "She spent every winter caring for children who had no family. She never spoke much about herself, but every first snowfall she baked an extra loaf of bread." Caleb looked at her quietly. "Why?" Mrs. Brooks smiled. "She always said there might be someone still waiting." Neither of them spoke for several moments. The fire crackled gently. Children laughed somewhere in the next room. The ordinary sounds made the years between them seem smaller somehow. Mrs. Brooks finally reached beneath the table and handed Caleb a worn leather journal tied with blue ribbon. "She asked me to give you this if you arrived after she had already left." Caleb hesitated before opening it. Every page described ordinary days. Harvests, snowfalls, church dinners, children learning to read. The entries never complained. They simply recorded a life spent helping others. Yet one sentence appeared every year on the first snowfall. "I hope Caleb remembered to make 2 cups of coffee today." His fingers rested on the faded ink longer than they should have. Mrs. Brooks watched without interrupting. At last she spoke. "Emily never married." Caleb slowly raised his eyes. "She said she had already given her heart to someone who deserved honesty more than convenience. She would not offer half of herself to another man." The room felt suddenly very still. Caleb closed the journal with great care. "Where is she now?" Mrs. Brooks walked to the window overlooking the snowy street. 3 days ago, a family from Ash Creek asked for help. Their youngest daughter fell dangerously ill. Emily left immediately. She never could ignore someone in need. Caleb smiled almost invisibly. "No," he said quietly. "She never could." Mrs. Brooks handed him a folded map with a route marked in blue pencil. "The roads will be difficult after tonight. Another storm is coming." Caleb slipped the map into his pocket beside Emily's letters. He thanked the woman with a simple nod before stepping back into the falling snow. As he tightened the saddle on his horse, he looked once more at the warm church windows behind him. Inside, someone refilled the second coffee cup he had left unfinished. Outside, fresh snow covered his tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. Far beyond the hills, another lonely cabin waited with 2 empty chairs beside a quiet table, and for the first time in 20 winters, Caleb no longer wondered whether anyone would ever sit in the second one again. The road to Ash Creek disappeared beneath fresh snow before noon, but Caleb rode steadily, trusting the blue pencil marks Emily had left more than the fading wagon tracks ahead of him. Every mile seemed to erase another year between them. He no longer traveled because of a promise made long ago. He traveled because somewhere beyond the White Hills was a woman who had quietly shaped every ordinary day of his life without standing beside him. By late afternoon, he reached a narrow valley where smoke curled gently from the chimney of a modest farmhouse. Children's laughter drifted through the cold air before the front door opened. A little girl wrapped in an oversized wool blanket stepped onto the porch holding a wooden spoon almost as long as her arm. She smiled at the stranger without fear. "Are you Mr. Turner?" she asked. Caleb stopped beside the gate. "I am." The child grinned. "Miss Emily said you would probably arrive before the next snowfall." She hurried back inside before he could ask another question. Moments later, an elderly farmer greeted him with a firm handshake and invited him to warm himself by the fire. The house was simple but full of life. Fresh bread cooled beside the window. Wet boots rested neatly near the stove. A knitted blanket covered a sleeping child on the sofa. Caleb noticed familiar stitches woven into the fabric. Emily's hands had made them. She stayed here nearly a month. The farmer explained while pouring coffee into 2 plain mugs. "Our youngest nearly died from pneumonia. Emily never left her bedside." Caleb accepted the cup without speaking. The warmth settled into his hands. Across the room stood an empty rocking chair with a blue shawl folded carefully across its back. He recognized it immediately. "She left yesterday morning." The farmer continued. "A ranch widow farther north lost her husband before harvest. Emily said there were children who needed help bringing in firewood before winter closed the roads." Caleb looked toward the window where evening snow had begun falling again. "She always finds someone who needs her," he said quietly. The farmer smiled. Perhaps because she spent her whole life believing someone else was waiting too. After supper, the farmer's wife handed Caleb a small cloth bag. Inside rested several cinnamon biscuits, still warm from the oven. Tucked beneath them lay a folded note written in Emily's familiar hand. "You still forget to eat when you travel. Some habits never change." Caleb could not help smiling. She remembered details no one else ever noticed. Before dawn, he prepared to leave again. As he tightened the saddle straps, the little girl ran across the yard carrying a tiny pine cone painted blue. "Miss Emily told me to give you this if you came after she left," the child said. "She said blue things are easier to find in winter." Caleb thanked her and slipped the pine cone into his coat pocket beside the letters. It rested there beside his heart as naturally as if it had always belonged. The farmer walked him to the gate. "Where will you go now?" he asked. Caleb unfolded the newest note once more. At the bottom, Emily had written only one sentence. "If you still wish to find me, come home before Christmas." Caleb looked toward the distant mountains where his lonely cabin waited beneath fresh snow. For the first time in 20 winters, he realized Emily had not been asking him to follow her. She had been finding her way back to him all along. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a sky so clear that every star seemed close enough to touch. Caleb reached his ranch just before sunset. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. Fresh snow rested along the porch rails. The fence still needed one loose board replaced. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney because he had been gone nearly a week. He unsaddled his horse, carried the blue scarf and the bundle of letters inside, and quietly built a fire. Soon the familiar smell of pine filled the cabin once again. Without thinking, he reached for 2 mugs instead of 1. This time he smiled at the habit instead of pretending it meant nothing. While the coffee brewed, he noticed something unusual beneath the front door. A narrow ribbon of light stretched across the floorboards. Someone stood outside. 3 soft knocks echoed through the cabin. Caleb opened the door. Snowflakes drifted gently through the evening air. Emily Carter stood on the porch wrapped in the same faded blue shawl, though silver now touched her hair just as it touched his. Time had changed their faces, but not their eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. 20 years disappeared without asking permission. Emily looked toward the warm cabin behind him before lowering her eyes with the same quiet smile she had worn as a young woman leaving the valley. "I hope I am not too late," she whispered. Caleb stepped aside without hesitation. "The coffee is still warm." She entered slowly, brushing snow from her coat before stopping beside the table. 2 mugs waited exactly where they always had. She looked at them for a long time. "You really did make 2 cups." Caleb poured coffee into the second mug. Every first snowfall, Emily wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Tears gathered in her eyes, but never fell. "I made an extra loaf of bread every year," she admitted softly. "I told everyone it was for travelers. It never was." Silence settled between them, comfortable and familiar. The fire cracked gently. Outside, The wind moved across the valley exactly as it had 20 winters before. Emily reached into her satchel and placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside lay dozens of letters tied with blue ribbon. None had ever been mailed. I wrote whenever I missed home, she said quietly. I never knew where to send them. Then too much time passed, and I became ashamed of how long I had waited. Caleb opened one at random. Every page began the same way. Dear Caleb. He closed the bundle without reading further. You came home, he said. That is enough. Emily looked at him with quiet surprise. You are not angry. Caleb slowly shook his head. Life asked something of both of us. You answered. She smiled through her tears. So did you. A loud knock interrupted the moment. Caleb opened the door to find young Thomas Miller from the neighboring ranch standing in the snow, breathing hard. Mr. Turner, the boy said anxiously. Old Mrs. Dawson's barn roof collapsed under the snow. The animals are freezing, and there are not enough hands. Caleb reached immediately for his coat. Before he could speak, Emily picked up her gloves. We should go, she said simply. They rode through the moonlit snow together, not as strangers reunited, but as two people who had quietly remembered how to walk beside one another. Under lantern light, they worked with neighbors until every frightened animal stood safely beneath shelter again. When the last gate was secured, Mrs. Dawson embraced Emily with grateful tears before turning to Caleb with a knowing smile. Your wife works harder than you do, the old woman laughed. Emily gently began to correct her, but Caleb only looked at her across the snowy yard. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them hurried to explain. For the first time in 20 years, the misunderstanding did not feel like one at all. Morning arrived quietly. After the long night of work, fresh sunlight rested across the snow, turning every fence rail into a line of gold. Caleb stepped onto the porch carrying 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to Emily without speaking. She accepted it with the familiar smile he had imagined through 20 winters. Neither hurried to fill the silence. They watched smoke rise from the neighboring chimneys while horses wandered slowly across the white pasture. Ordinary moments had become precious because they had almost never happened. After breakfast, Emily rolled up her sleeves and noticed the loose fence board Caleb had ignored before leaving for Laramie. She reached for the hammer without asking permission. Caleb picked up the nails. They worked side by side exactly as they had when they were young. One held the timber while the other drove the nails. They exchanged only a few quiet words, yet every movement felt effortless, as though 20 years had been only a long afternoon. By noon, the repaired fence stretched straight across the pasture. Emily stepped back to admire it. Still not perfectly level, she teased. Caleb looked along the posts before answering. It will hold. She laughed softly. You always cared more about strong than pretty. He almost smiled. You always noticed. Later they carried hay into the barn together. Emily paused beside an old wooden stall where a faded blue ribbon still hung from a rusty nail. She touched it gently. You kept this. Caleb nodded. You tied it there after Daisy foaled her first colt. Emily lowered her hand. I forgot. Caleb shook his head. I did not. That afternoon several neighbors arrived with pies, bread, and fresh vegetables to thank them for helping Mrs. Dawson. No one questioned why Emily remained at the ranch. No one whispered. They simply welcomed another familiar face home. Before leaving, old Mrs. Dawson pressed a knitted pair of mittens into Emily's hands. A woman should not spend another winter traveling alone, she said warmly. Emily thanked her, but looked toward Caleb before answering. I do not think I will. When evening settled over the valley, Caleb lit the oil lamp while Emily prepared supper from the biscuits, vegetables, and bread their neighbors had brought. The cabin slowly filled with the quiet sounds of a shared life. Plates touched the table. The kettle sang softly above the stove. Firelight danced across the stone hearth. It was nothing extraordinary. That was exactly why it mattered. After they finished eating, Emily carried the empty cups to the wash basin. Caleb noticed she still preferred only 1 spoonful of sugar. She noticed he still left the window cracked slightly open while the fire burned. Some habits had survived distance better than memory itself. Before bed, Emily unfolded the unfinished blue scarf once more. She threaded fresh yarn through the waiting needle and carefully completed the final stitches she had promised to finish 20 years earlier. When she placed the scarf around Caleb's shoulders, it fit as though it had always belonged there. Caleb touched the soft wool without looking away from her. You finished it. Emily nodded. I finished coming home too. Caleb stood quietly for a long moment before reaching into his coat pocket. He removed the small blue pine cone the little girl had given him and set it on the windowsill beside the lamp. Then this belongs here now, he said. Emily slipped her hand into his. Neither spoke another word. Outside, winter covered the valley once again. Inside, the cabin no longer felt like the home of a lonely cowboy waiting for a promise. It had become the home of two people who had finally chosen the same tomorrow. Winter settled gently across the valley during the days that followed. Nothing remarkable happened, and that became the greatest gift either of them could remember. Caleb repaired the old chicken coop, while Emily swept the porch free of fresh snow every morning before sunrise. She baked bread that filled the cabin with the warm scent of cinnamon and wheat. He stacked another row of firewood beside the door without being asked. They moved through each day with the quiet rhythm of people who had finally stopped measuring time by what they had lost. One afternoon, Emily carried the worn wooden box of unsent letters onto the porch. The sky was bright after the storm, and the mountains stood sharp against the pale blue horizon. She placed the bundle between them. There is one letter you should read, she said softly. Only one. Caleb untied the faded blue ribbon. The paper she pointed toward had grown yellow with age. Across the top, she had written a date from nearly 20 years before, only a few weeks after leaving the valley. He unfolded it carefully. Dear Caleb, today I almost came home. I stood inside the train station with enough money for a ticket west. Then a frightened little boy lost his mother in the crowd. I stayed to help him. That became one day. Then another. I kept believing there would always be time to return before too many seasons passed. I was wrong. If I have waited too long, I will understand. But if you ever wonder whether I forgot you, please never believe it. I carried our valley with me every single winter. Caleb finished reading and quietly folded the letter along its original creases. He did not speak for several moments. The wind stirred the pine trees below the hill. Finally, he looked toward Emily. You do not owe me those missing years. Emily lowered her eyes. I always believed I did. Caleb gently shook his head. Those years became part of who you are. They became part of who I am too. She smiled sadly. I thought you deserved an apology. You came home, he answered. That is the only answer I ever needed. Emily's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. This time neither of them pulled away. They remained there until the coffee grew cold and the afternoon light softened into evening. Before sunset, Emily stood and walked toward the stone fireplace. She gathered every unopened letter she had written through the years and held them quietly against her heart. I carried these because I thought they were all I had left, she whispered. Caleb stepped beside her. You do not have to carry them anymore. Together they placed the letters inside the old cedar chest beneath the family Bible rather than into the fire. They were not reminders of regret. They were proof that hope had survived distance, silence, and time. Emily closed the lid gently. Let them stay here, she said. The waiting is finished. Caleb nodded once. It is. As darkness settled across the ranch, they stepped outside together. The first stars appeared above the mountains exactly as they had on the night she left 20 winters earlier. Emily slipped her arm through Caleb's without a word. They stood facing the quiet valley until a distant church bell echoed across the snow. Tomorrow would bring ordinary chores, another pot of coffee, another sunrise over the fences. Neither of them wished for anything grander. At last they had reached the place where promises no longer belonged to the past. They belonged to every morning still waiting ahead. Spring arrived quietly, almost shyly, as though the valley itself wished to give the old ranch one gentle beginning after another. Snow melted from the fence posts first. Then the creek found its voice beneath the ice. Meadowlarks returned to the cottonwood tree where a young woman had once whispered a promise before climbing into a stagecoach 20 winters earlier. Caleb noticed every change. So did Emily. They never spoke much about the years they had lost. Instead, they filled the days they had been given. Every morning Caleb rose before sunrise to start the fire. By the time the kettle began to sing, Emily would already be kneading bread beside the kitchen window, her sleeves dusted with flour while the first light touched the mountains beyond the pasture. 2 mugs waited on the table, not because someone might return anymore, because both of them were finally home. Neighbors stopped by often, never needing an invitation. Mrs. Dawson brought fresh blackberry preserves. The Miller children laughed while helping gather eggs from the chicken coop. On Saturdays, the church families shared meals beneath the shade of the old cottonwood tree. Emily knew every child's name within a few weeks. Caleb repaired broken wagon wheels for anyone who arrived at the ranch. People no longer spoke about the lonely cowboy who waited 20 winters. They simply spoke about the Turner's place, where the coffee was always hot and the front door was never locked during daylight. One quiet afternoon, Emily opened the cedar chest once more. She lifted the bundle of unsent letters, smiled softly, and carried them outside. Caleb watched without asking why. Together they walked to the cottonwood tree overlooking the valley. Emily tied the faded blue ribbon around one strong branch and gently placed the letters beneath the roots inside a small wooden box. "They belong to yesterday," she whispered. Caleb rested his weathered hand over hers. "And tomorrow belongs here." She nodded. Neither looked back as they returned to the house. Summer followed with fields of wildflowers stretching across the hills. Caleb finally replaced the old porch swing that had creaked for years. Emily stitched blue curtains for the kitchen windows from fabric she found in town. The unfinished scarf she had carried for 2 decades hung beside the front door every winter, no longer waiting to be completed, only reminding them that some promises grow stronger when life asks them to wait. One crisp autumn morning, a young traveler stopped at the ranch asking for directions. Before leaving, he noticed the 2 coffee mugs resting on the porch railing. "Expecting company?" he asked with an easy smile. Caleb looked toward Emily, who was hanging fresh laundry beneath the bright Wyoming sky. She looked back and smiled the same quiet smile he had carried in memory for 20 long winters. "No," Caleb answered gently. Company already arrived. The traveler tipped his hat and continued down the road without realizing he had witnessed the ending of a story that had begun before he was born. That evening, the valley settled into peaceful silence. Emily placed a fresh loaf of bread on the table. Caleb hung his hat beside hers. Their boots rested next to one another by the front door. Firelight danced across the stone hearth while the scent of pine and warm coffee filled the cabin. Outside, the repaired fence stretched across the pasture, straight and steady beneath the fading sunset. Inside, 2 well-worn mugs waited side by side, not as symbols of longing, but as ordinary parts of an ordinary life built one quiet kindness at a time. They had not simply fallen in love. After 20 winters, one promise, and countless small acts of faith, they had finally found the place where they both belonged.